Hello and welcome to the Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. My name is Sam Levy with the CCO, Transforming College Students to Transform the World. And I'm here as always with Byron Borger from Hearts and Minds Books. We're here to tell you about some books that you ought to think about reading and checking out. Byron, how are you?
I'm doing good, Sam. It's always great to talk with you. I admire your work there in the CCO as a nurturing our staff in the Philly area. CCO got started out in Pittsburgh, as some of our listeners know, but we've expanded to various places. So it's fun. It's fun that we're almost neighbors these days, and so it's good to be with you, Sam, here on the podcast.
Yeah, great. Well, we are talking today about prayer. The last episode was on Bibles. And so Bible reading and prayer, two really key spiritual disciplines. So I think that's fitting to come on the heels of the Bible episode. So we're going to look at some books on prayer.
3 books I'm allowed to talk about, right?
That's right. It's in the name of the podcast.
I enjoy reading books about prayer. That's not to say I pray very much or that I've learned that much, but vicariously, almost like outdoor education or other things. I like reading books about travel, but I've never really gone anywhere. And I love reading books about prayer, even though I don't do it very well. Evangelism, too, it's another topic. I've read lots of books on that, but avoid it like the plague. So anyway, yeah, I'm not saying I know much about this, but I have read the books. And so if I'm only going to pick 3, this is so complicated because there's so many good ones out there. There really are. New ones, old ones. I'm going to pick 3. And they're very different in style, but I think they're all good that our customers, whether you are CCO staff working with students, whether you're a church leader, or whether you're just an ordinary person like me, just living day by day, and you happen to be listening in on this, I think one of these is going to work for you. These are all really good books. The first one is called A Praying Life. It's by a guy named Paul Miller. Paul lives down in the Philadelphia area. I happen to have met him a time or two. I know his son, who lives here near York, runs a Dairy Queen, in fact. So I really, really like Paul. He's written a book on love, which is really good. He's written a book on the gospel, kind of gospel-centered living, as he calls it. He's written a book called The J Curve, which is about sort of descending down with Christ, brokenness, and then up and rising with Christ, and how in Jesus you kind of reenact his death and resurrection in our own lives. The J Curve, about coping with our sin. He's really honest about deep, serious theology. He happens to be a Reformed theologian, a Reformed church leader. So he's got a good emphasis on that sort of brokenness and sin and Christ alone as our salvation. Well, this book, Praying Life, a number of people that I respect early on told me it was the best book on prayer they ever read. And I read it as well, found it very, very useful. And there's really good folks like his friend Paul David Tripp, who has endorsed it and said a book that not only teaches you how to pray, but makes you want to pray. Dan Allender, who we in the CCO really, really like, a psychologist from the West Coast, says this is a book is like having the breath of God at your back. Let it lift you to new hope. So I like this book a lot. One of the things that he does in here, let me just tell you the table of contents. The first part, of which there's like 8 chapters, there's a lot in here, is called Learning to Pray Like a Child. And I really like this bit about just talking with your daddy, about talking with your parent. Learning to be helpless is one of the chapters. Crying out, Abba, as you know. Bending your heart towards the Father. This is really good and a really good foundation for anyone entering into the throne room to think about intercession and prayer. The second part is called Learning to Trust Again. There's only 3 chapters in here, but they are really substantial. And one has touched my life a lot. It is called Understanding Cynicism. Understanding cynicism. So you can't really deepen a childlike trust in God and enter into a deeper level of prayer until you follow Jesus out of cynicism. Isn't that a great line? And then developing an eye for Jesus in seeing him, eyes wide open all over the world and what he would care about. So that learning to trust again is a beautiful little section. Then learning to ask your Father, living in your Father's story. is about unanswered prayer and how to place yourself in God's story. There's some of the things that we talked about last episode with the Bible, introductory Bible books about entering God's story, reading as in a narrative, and finding your place within that story. He does a little bit of that in this book on prayer, that our prayer lives are rooted in our broader story, and our broader story is shaped by the redemptive history of the biblical narrative that leads to the restoration of all things. So he gets a good picture here. We in the CCO like this kind of stuff. And then the last part, there's 7 or 8 chapters called Praying in Real Life. Gives you real practical prayer tools, how to keep prayer cards, how to do prayer work, how to listen to God. So there is more than you would ever need or want in this great book, A Praying Life, one of the better books out there on prayer. I list it as the most basic of the 3 I'm going to share in this podcast, but it's not simplistic. It is easy to read, but there's a lot of content. I highly recommend it. Maybe not as your absolute first book on prayer, but certainly as a basic one that we could all read. Do you know anything
Yeah, you
about
said
Paul Miller? Have you come across any of his books, Sam?
I'm familiar with the name.
Yeah,
Um,
he's big in the New Life circles down there and Liberty and
sure,
some of the other churches in Philly that I know CCO even partners with. So
right.
that's sort of neat. He has a couple of ministries himself. He has a special needs child, so he's got a heart for those kind of concerns. Tells some neat stories in this book. So yeah, he's a good guy.
That's great. You said basic but not simplistic, and it's interesting. A book on prayer and developing a life of prayer that touches on different aspects of our lives that maybe we wouldn't think to associate with prayer, like as you said, cynicism and trust and
Yeah,
things like that.
yeah.
So,
Well, the next one is an absolute classic in my view. I adore this book, and I wish more people would know about it. It's by a Presbyterian seminary professor who has since retired. His wife is a neuroscientist and got a job at Pitt working on children's literacy and all kind of stuff around the brain. And they've essentially now moved on from Pittsburgh as well. But because his wife is a scholar, he's not working as a professor anymore. But he is an author, and he's written some great, great resources. This is a book called Kneeling with the Giants. Kneeling with the Giants by Neal Hansen, a friend of ours. He's been to our store. He's done some conferences with us in Presbyterian circles, PCUSA circles. And this book, the subtitle is Learning to Pray with History's Best Teachers. What Gary does in this book, and it's so good in so many levels, a little serious, a little more attentive to some deeper things maybe than even the Paul Miller book. But this Kneeling with the Giants, each chapter is a different saint from church history and how they prayed or what they taught about prayer or what they were known for. I mean, just for instance, what language shall I borrow? That great line from that great hymn is the first section. It's praying with St. Benedict is the first one, and that's the divine office. The divine praying in fixed hour prayer throughout the day. Most of us don't do that, but the monks do. And many lay people are now increasingly learning about the fixed hour prayer of Benedictine spirituality. So he looks at what Benedict meant by that. The next one is praying with Martin Luther. Guess what Luther did? He used the Lord's Prayer over and over, used it in catechism and used it in his prayer life and wrote and preached about it. And so the second chapter is what you can learn about using the Lord's Prayer as a prayer tool from Luther. The next one is this anonymous pilgrim. Nobody knows who wrote this book, but it's called The Jesus Prayer, a Russian mystic that was a pilgrim. And he wrote this classic breath prayer book called The Jesus Prayer. So in the first 3 chapters, he's introduced you to an Orthodox mystic, a classic reformer, Martin Luther, and a Catholic, a medieval Catholic saint, Benedict Luther and the Anonymous Pilgrim. The next section is called Praying with Scripture. He gives you 2 chapters in there, how to pray with John Calvin, and Calvin used the Psalms. So this is using the Psalms in prayer. So again, it's about how to use the Psalms in prayer and what Calvin taught about it. So you're doing sort of a church history thing, learning from the saints and the giants, and learning some practical stuff about prayer. This is a 2-for-1 book here. The next one after Calvin is St. Ignatius of Loyola, again, a Roman Catholic counter-Reformation, same medieval era. St. Ignatius of Loyola used the senses. And anybody that knows anything about his system of prayer or his journey towards prayer, he gives you these different steps and stuff that you do. and you use the senses, observing God, seeing where God showed up, realizing where we maybe blew it, and using that daily prayer mechanism by way of your senses. And so that's a great chapter. And your senses in evaluating the scripture with reflective, prayerful understandings of scripture. Gary's really good at that, by the way. The next one is called Conversations in the Light and the Dark. He looks at Teresa of Avila about recollections in the very presence of God. He looks at the Puritans, and the Puritans were known for writing out their prayers. And so he looks at the way Puritans prayed. And then he looks at the cloud of unknowing, kind of a mystical contemplation in the dark, he calls it. The next section's on asking God for help. He looks at Agnes Sanford, a contemporary writer of the late 20th century who wrote a book on healing. And he looks at Andrew Murray on intercession. Murray was an evangelist, white guy that visited South Africa, lived in South Africa in the 1800s and was a preacher. And he looks at his intercessory work. So this is a really great book where you're learning about some of the greats, how they prayed, what they did, whether they used the Lord's Prayer, whether they printed their prayers, or whether they used their senses, or whether they cried out for God and help. Each of these different styles. Gary says in the preface of this book, he also says it in the afterword. There's a great appendix on how to use this in a group or in a church or in a small group. And in the study guide in the back, both in the beginning and the end, he has a very poignant note that the reason people read books like this is not only to learn about the saints and the great cloud of witnesses that have gone before us and what they've taught, and not only learning some tools about how and why to pray, but also so that you would actually do it. Heavy as it may seem with all these mystical and heavy Reformation era people, his point of writing this book, he says, is to help you actually pray. And so he says, to me, reading a book about prayer, it's not the same as praying. You got to do more than just read this stuff. You actually got to do what it says. Practice in the ways of the Puritans or of St. Ignatius or of the medieval mystics or of Julian and Norwich or whoever. Use their tools to actually do it yourself. And he reminds us that reading a book about prayer, thank you very much, Gary, reading a book about prayer is not the same as praying. So he invites you to actually do this stuff, and he gives you some appendices in the end to actually make it real for your own prayer practices. So I like this book because it's how do you pray? And he says there's a lot of ways to pray. And the saints in the past have given us guidance. And so we can stand on their shoulders and kneel with the giants, as he puts it.
Yeah, that's really beautiful, the way that prayer is certainly a spiritual discipline, and so there is discipline involved, but it's sometimes I think the counter that I've heard people have to a focus on spiritual disciplines is, things can turn into this sort of religiosity for its own sake, these practices for their own sake, and the way that there's here's all these different ways that these kind of exemplars in the faith through the years have engaged their own prayer life, and you can figure out what your prayer life is going to look like by maybe taking their ideas, but however way you begin to practice that is going to be better than certainly than not practicing it. So that's kind of liberating in that way, that here's all of these different ways to engage prayer and to make that more of a part of your life.
Yep. And I don't know if anybody was counting, but there's 10 different people in here that he gives you 10 different ways to pray. So, geez, what more do you need to get started? I think actually it's just fascinating to learn about these saints from the past. And often we tend to study their theology or their revival efforts within the church, what they did. When you think of Luther, the Puritans, or Ignatius of Loyola, you study their theology and their role in a revival or renewal of the congregations or whatever. This looks at their prayer life. And there isn't as much church history stuff seen through the lens of the deep practices of prayer and spirituality that are in these former prayer warriors and mystics. So I think it's a great, great tool. It's really reliable, really informative, 10 different ways to pray. Well, and now I'm going to tell you about another book. And this is one I know that both of the authors that I just cited would probably appreciate. They may not be quite where he is, but I know they both name this book because everybody esteems it as one of the great books of prayer written in the 20th century. Came out near the end of the 20th century, but it's one of the great books of the last 100 years. It's by Richard Foster, and it is called Prayer, Finding the Heart's True Home. Richard Foster wrote a book that is truly one of the great classics of the 20th century called Celebration of Discipline. It was inspired by Dallas Willard, who was a mentor of his, and Willard invited him to write this book as a Quaker about the medieval and other ancient mystics, many who were Catholic, who talked about the contemplative, meditative life, the deeper life, and the disciplines of service and study and prayer and silence and solitude and worship, the kind of fasting, the things that always have worked in the past to help deepen people's spirituality. Foster, in that book, Celebration of Discipline, starts off saying that the crisis of our time in the latter portion of the 20th century is that we are superficial people. We're a mile wide and an inch deep, and we don't need more information. We need more depth. And so that critique of being a superficial people, he calls us to the celebration of spiritual disciplines. Well, one chapter in that book of the celebration of disciplines was on prayer. And many people thought it was one of the best chapters on prayerfulness and solitude in prayer. And so he expanded that chapter into a meditation book called Meditative Prayer. And then he did this one. It is called Prayer, Finding the Heart's True Home. What this book does is it gives you, I believe it's 15 different kinds of prayer. Am I right that it's 15? There's 21 chapters, 21 chapters. So there's 21 ways to pray. He doesn't link them each one to one spiritual saint the way Gary does in his book, but he does cite church history, people, a breadth of evangelicals and charismatics and Anglicans and Reformed people and Quakers and mystics and Catholics. So he's very ecumenical in the best sense of the word, drawing broadly on everybody that's written wisely about these things. And what he does in this book is he gives you a bunch of different ways to pray. The first part is called Seeking the Transformation We Need. And he's got prayers of the forsaken, prayers of the examined, that's Ignatius, prayer of tears, how crying can be prayers, prayers of relinquishment, formational prayer, covenant prayer. He describes what he means by each of these. Those are 7 chapters. Then he goes with 7 more called Moving Upward. And these are seeking the intimacy with God that we need. And he has prayers of adoration, prayers of rest, sacramental prayer, unceasing prayer. That's a great chapter. The prayer of the heart, meditative prayer that he is really good on, and contemplative prayer. He says something's a little different between contemplation and meditation. He has a chapter on each of those, worth the price of the book. Then the next part, after the moving inward to the transformation we need, moving upward to the intimacy we need, the third unit is called moving outward. And this is seeking the ministry we need in a prayerful way. Again, this is prayer, but it's moving outward. He calls prayer of the ordinary, one of my favorite chapters in the whole book, petitionary prayer, praying for others and for ministry and for God's will to be done, intercessory prayer, which is different than petitionary prayer, healing prayer, powerful chapter, the prayer of suffering, and what he calls radical prayer. Now, Karl Barth talked about taking the hand of God when one prays over politics, because God is the Lord, and Jesus, the Lord, is the true King, has something at stake in our political world. And so a prayer of grabbing the hand of the sovereign King of the universe who is wounded. It's a hand that's wounded. And that chapter, Radical Prayer, is worth the price of the book as well. This book has been an impact to me. It's been a tender and challenging and important book to me. And it's one I recommend probably more often than any if people are ready for it. 21 ways to pray. Every chapter is fairly short. It's not super heavy, but you want to go through it carefully. It is deep. I don't know if you have to read Celebration of Discipline first. Some people do. I don't think you do. And in a way, this is more accessible than that. I tell some people to start here with his various ways of praying and then read Celebration of Discipline, where he goes a little deeper into the disciplines that actually allow you to create space in your life for this transforming encounter with God, whether you're moving upward to God or inward into your own heart or outward into the world, which God loves so much. So anyway, that's Prayer by Richard Foster. The subtitle is Finding the Heart's True Home. The Kneeling with the Giants by Gary Neal Hansen, Learning to Pray with history's best teachers, and this fairly recent one, A Praying Life by Paul Miller. There's a sequel to this that just came out, by the way, called The Praying Church. And so if you want to do this in community, that would be a good read to follow up as well. So there you go. 3 great books on prayer, 3 that have meant a lot to me. Sam, I know you're a man of great depth and not superficial at all, which is why I'm so glad you're hosting this this week. Thanks for letting me talk about these books. 3 from Hearts and Minds.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing those. This is a little bit cheating, but I'll reference a book just for the sake of talking about prayer, or a series of books now. But the Every Moment Holy series by Douglas McKelvey. You didn't mention it, but it comes to mind in thinking about a life of prayer. I think those are books of liturgies, these prayers that he's written and crafted for all of these different occasions, and occasions that you wouldn't necessarily think to pray or think to write a prayer for, or at least I wouldn't. Things like when you're missing a friend, or a prayer when you're preparing a meal, or even a prayer before you're going to play a board game. I think one of the central things that I've kind of picked up from sitting with those and praying through many of those is that when is the right time to pray? Anytime, any occasion, big or small, minute, it's a beautiful thing to engage whatever you're doing prayerfully, and thinking
It's
prayerfully
interesting,
about.
interesting, Sam, that you mentioned that, because I had the 3rd volume, which he edited, but has a variety of writers, a variety of people. And our friend Ned Buster there in Lancaster designed the art and created them. They're so beautiful as books. The 3rd one just came out in the smaller size leather. They're nice hardback leathers, volume 1, 2, and 3, different colors. The 2nd one's about grief and lament. The 3rd one is written by other people. But the 3rd one just came out in the small size. So I had book noted about it in our book notes newsletter just a week ago, highlighting our discount on those. And I thought to myself, I wish I could do that. And I thought, nope, I'm only supposed to do 3. But I literally had it in my hand an hour ago thinking I should show this new one because I had just written about it. But you are so right. For those that want printed prayer, as Gary suggested in this book, is one way to pray, printed out prayers. And those can be done in various voices too. If you've got a spouse or a loved one or a family member or a kid, you can do them in 2 different colors and 2 different readings, which is why they call them liturgies and not just books of prayer. They're liturgies to be read over all different sorts of places in life. Beautiful resources. They feel well in the hand. The large leather-bound hardbacks or the small soft soft-bound leather bounds, ribbon markers and stuff. Yeah, they're really good. Thanks for mentioning them.
Yeah.
Way to go.
Well, thank you, Byron. As always, thank you all for listening. We love you all and appreciate you listening. And we want to invite you, as always, to place an order by clicking the first link in the episode description. Remember that it's 20% off on all the books that you order from this episode. Please like and share our podcast wherever you can, and we would love to talk to you. We'd love to hear if you read these books, if you're going to read them, if you have other books on prayer that have been meaningful to you. We love to talk about books, especially Byron, so feel free to contact either or both of us and share what you think about the books that you're reading in the comments. So for Byron, Hearts and Minds Books, and the CCO, this has been another episode of the 3 Books from Hearts and Minds podcast.